Kate, I feel like each fortnight we get a chance to sit down with someone that is kind of extraordinary in their own way. And today, I feel like that would be an understatement. We have someone with us who is doing things that, I mean, you just have to stand back and admire from a distance. And sometimes, like now, you get up close and personal and you can actually ask some questions of your own. So, Kate, I might do the intro for this one. We're chatting to Peter Singer. And if I just do a very short intro to Peter, it won't do him justice. But just some of the notes that we've got here is Peter is one of the world's leading moral philosophers. He's a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He's the author and co-founder of a book and a website that you can go and visit now, The Life You Can Save. It's an organization that inspires and empowers people to take action in the fight against extreme poverty. Peter, on behalf of Kate and I, it's our pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Owen, for that generous introduction, and I'm happy to be with you and with Kate.
Maybe, Peter, what we can do to start off with is maybe just, I guess we're going to try and fit this into a very concise answer, but maybe you can just give us a bit of your backstory and how you came to be involved in such an important topic.
Oh, well, I don't know where the story begins exactly, but I suppose it really begins with the decision to go into philosophy. I originally studied to do law, and the arts was kind of a little side issue to make the law degree a little bit more interesting. But I ended up then getting a scholarship to go to Oxford and study philosophy there. And I was always interested in the areas of philosophy that made a difference to your life. So clearly that was going to be ethics and perhaps political philosophy. Mm-hmm. And even when I was just a student or still at Oxford, I started thinking about the obligations of people who, like myself, were living a comfortable material life in an affluent country, as in regard to people who were in extreme poverty and extreme need. And it was the crisis in what's now Bangladesh that arose in 1971 that made me write my first piece about this, because there were 9 million refugees from what was then East Pakistan who flooded into India, and India needed help to feed them. And so I was asking myself, well, what ought I to be doing? Here are 9 million people who, may not get fed enough, may not have sanitation, and what are my obligations to help them? And that article got me going on the topic, and it's not the only topic I've been writing about, of course, but it's one of the main themes of my work since then.
I've heard you be described as one of the most influential living philosophers, which is quite the title, and hence my humbling that you are joining us here today. Obviously, you spent a lot of time earlier in your career working on improving, I guess, the ethics in how we treat animals. And now, I guess that would be an entirely different topic for another day. But I would encourage all of our listeners, and we'll provide links in the show notes to go and look at Peter's bio on the Life You Can Save Australia. We'll put a link in the show notes to that. But today we're talking more about altruism and effective altruism and how people can give back. So, Kate, I know you've got quite a few questions that you want to put to Peter, and I'm excited to hear his answers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty exciting to interview someone who has a Wikipedia page. So, Peter, to start the conversation off, I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about what can we do as individuals to financially support others, both in Australia and internationally?
Well, as individuals, obviously, one thing we can do is to donate to the most effective organizations that are helping people in need. And I believe the most effective organizations are those that are helping people in low-income countries rather than in Australia, because we're very fortunate in Australia that both that we're an affluent country, but also that we have a government that does provide for basic needs for people who otherwise are struggling. And I'm not in any way belittling the state of poverty that exists in Australia, and I think we should do more about it. But people in Australia can take such a lot of things for granted that people in other countries can't. Things like clean water, for instance, being able for their children to go to school, but also healthcare. You don't have to have money to get decent healthcare in Australia, and getting enough to eat, basics like that. Whereas in many parts of the world, there are people in extreme poverty, as defined by the World Bank, that's living, roughly speaking, on less than $2 a day, who can't take those things for granted. And so, obviously, money goes further if you're using it to help people in much greater need, for whom $2 a day is their total income. So $1,000 is more than they're going to earn in a year. Whereas $1,000 for an Australian, an Australian in poverty might be useful, but it's not going to be life-changing. So I think we need to look for those organisations, and also among those organisations, because there are quite a few of them, we need to look for the ones that have been independently assessed and verified as giving really great value for every dollar that they receive. So I think that's the best way. Obviously, that's the way that most people can make use of. Clearly, there are other things you can do. You can use your time and skills rather than money in order to support those organizations, if you have time and skills. But for most people going about their daily lives, making significant donations, giving a reasonable proportion of your income to helping people in extreme poverty, I think is the best thing you can do.
Peter, I've got two questions on this. I guess the first one is related to the second. How much does it take to save a life? I don't know if it's crude for me to ask that question, but I've heard it asked before, and that's kind of my first question. And then the second one is, how can we, as people that are sitting at home listening to this, people that earn a salary, how can we think about how much we should give on that basis?
Right. Well, I think the question, how much does it cost to save a life, is not at all, too crude a question. I think those are the sorts of questions we ought to be asking when we're comparing different organizations. Can this different organizations that are trying to save lives? Of course, there are some organizations that might be doing things like restoring sight in people who have cataracts, or preventing people going blind. That's a different comparison. But let's just focus on organizations that are doing things like saving lives. One example of this would be the Against Malaria Foundation, which distributes bed nets in malaria-prone regions. And it can be pretty clearly shown that when families, and particularly children, sleep under bed nets, they are less likely to die from malaria, less likely to get malaria, obviously, and some of those who get malaria then die. So you can ask yourself, how much does a bed net cost? And the answer to that is very little, $2 or something. But that's not the cost of saving the life, because you have to distribute the bed net, you have to educate the families on how to use it. Plus, obviously, not every bed net is going to save a life. You have to distribute a lot of bed nets to have confidence that statistically you will have saved a life. So an organization called GiveWell has assessed this, and it's come up with a figure of around $3,000 to save a life by distributing bed nets, which is a long way from $2. But on the other hand, it's also a long way under what affluent countries, including Australia, spend to save a life of somebody who is seriously ill and perhaps has to go into intensive care, where you might easily spend $1,000 or more per day that a person is in intensive care. So it is very cheap by affluent world standards to save a life for that.
And I thought
you then asked the second question. So how much should people give? In the book, The Life You Can Save, which anybody can download for free from thelifeyoucansave.org or .org.au, I have a table at the back, kind of appendix, which is a bit like tax tables, in that I'm suggesting a percentage that you give that increases as your income increases, because as your income increases, obviously you can afford to give a higher percentage of that income. So I start out with just 1% for people earning around $40,000, and I go up to giving away a third of your income for people who are seriously wealthy, earning, let's say, $1 million or something. And of course, one could say, well, somebody earning $1 million could give away 2/3 of their income and still have quite a lot of money to live on. Why just 1/3? So what I'm trying to do here is to find amounts that I don't think anybody could say is a really serious sacrifice to their quality of life. And yet, when you add up, what we would raise if people gave this, it's vastly larger than the amounts of money that are given to help people in extreme poverty at present. And I think it's enough to say if it was used wisely, we would have a good chance of, I wouldn't say eliminating, but reducing extreme poverty to small pockets rather than to the 750 million or so people who the World Bank says are in extreme poverty today.
And one of the interesting things that your organization does, it actually looks for those charities and organizations that are using everyone's dollars in the most effective way. Because I think often people I've spoken to in Australia, they maybe don't donate. Sometimes that's a reason that puts them off, because they know that only 50 cents in the dollar is actually going to help someone, and the other 50 cents is going to all of the administration and back office and advertising. How do we ensure that the money we donate makes the most impact in the world?
Well, I think the answer to that is by donating to societies where the impact has been verified as being very good value for the dollars you're giving. And there's two things to think about there. You just mentioned the percentage that actually goes to the project rather to administration or further fundraising. And of course, in some cases, if 50% is going for administration, that's probably not going to be very good value. But on the other hand, as anybody who's run a business knows, you need to have some administration to make the business run efficiently itself. And if all that people think about is how low is the proportion that goes on administration and fundraising, then they're going to put pressure on organizations to cut their staff to the point where even if they can say 90% of what we raise goes to the low-income country, they can't say that it's actually doing what we want it to, because they don't have the staff to supervise and check up that it is doing what we want it to. So we need to balance that. We need to balance the amount that is going to administration to make sure that organizations can still be efficient in what they're doing. And we need to know that the impact of their projects is really good. And some projects you could spend as much as you like on it, but they wouldn't really achieve very much. It's been demonstrated that a variety of projects have failed. Projects need to be tested in the field, and ideally they need to be tested against kind of the equivalent of a placebo in drug testing. So in other words, say for the distribution of bed nets against malaria that I mentioned, you need to have some baselines with how many children died in villages when there was no bed nets distributed, and how many children died in villages where bed nets were distributed. And then you can get a really good picture that, yes, this is an impactful program that saves lives. Or, how many people had their sight restored through cataract surgery through this program, rather than other places where there was no non-government organization that was providing cataract surgery. So those are the things that we're looking for, and the Life You Can Save is looking for that kind of evidence, and it's drawing on some other organizations because we can't do all that research ourselves. It's drawing on, I mentioned already, GiveWell, another organization that does this, and Impact Matters is another organization. So we're pulling together research that is done by different organizations and making it easily accessible to you on our website, thelifeyoucansave.org.
Peter, one of the things that I struggle with is I want to give and I want to do it as effectively as I can, and we'll get to this in just a minute. But one of the things that I think about in the back of my mind, just for full disclosure, I'm an investor by trade. I'm an analyst and I invest money for a living. And one of the things that I struggle with is making the decision of, okay, I've got $1 now. I could donate that right now. Or if I saved and invested well, maybe in 3 to 5 years, I can give a lot more and more often. So I guess the question is for people that are listening to this as much as myself is, should we wait until we've sorted out our finances, got on top of debts and all that sort of stuff, or should we just start now and give a little bit? I feel like I might know your answer, but we'll
Yes.
see.
So I do think that starting now and giving something is a good thing to do, because it's a learning process, and it's also, if you like, a habit forming process. And some habits are good to form early. So I think it puts you in touch with organisations and you learn about them, and you may not be giving very much, but it'll help to form your choices later on when you have more to give. Now, in terms of the question, well, is it better to give to reinvest and give later? That really depends on your rate of return as compared to the rate of return of what you might call an investment in reducing poverty. Because, of course, there is a rate of return of that. If you give money to a family now that helps to lift them out of poverty, then they may be better able to educate their children, and their children may then have better jobs and better positions and may help the economy of the country where they're living in. So to that extent, it's better to give now rather than later. On the other hand, your return on your investment means it's better to give later. So, I'm actually very glad that Warren Buffett didn't give away most of the first $1 million he earned, because...
And that was going to be my follow-up question.
Right, okay, I've anticipated, yeah. Yeah, because, he invested that and reinvested it, and now he's given away, I think, something like $30 billion, and he's given it effectively through the Gates Foundation as well. So if you fancy that you're as good as Warren Buffett, your rate of return is probably better than the rate of return on investing in poverty reduction. But most of us ordinary mugs probably aren't quite up to that level.
I wouldn't hold myself in such esteem.
Yeah, and I think that's quite interesting, the idea of building that habit early, because if we just think that we're going to start donating when we've sorted out our life, we've raised our kids, everything like that, we might be 50 or 60. And I mean, the probability that you're going to start doing it then when you haven't done it for the decades prior is probably quite low.
It probably is quite low. Plus, don't forget that hopefully you want to be an example for your kids. And I think it's important that kids know, when they're young, that their parents are giving some money to people who are much less well off than they are. And I think that very often forms habits. If you talk to people who do give, and you say, why? Well, many of them did grow up in a home that gave, and it just comes much more naturally to them than those who don't.
Yeah, I think my first experience with sort of donating and giving to others was through a sponsor child my parents had as we grew up, and sort of you grew up and you saw that child grow up alongside of you, and that was probably my first exposure to donating and helping others.
Yeah, I think that's quite often the case. Those organisations have been very popular with families for that kind of reason.
Yeah. So one of the other questions I wanted to ask is, because this is something that I've thought about in Australia. Do you think there are too many charities globally, and does this lead to an inefficient use of funds? Because I know there's like hundreds of thousands of registered charities in Australia, and every sort of second person seems to be setting something up for their own cause. Do you think that's an inefficient use of funds, or should we sort of focus on consolidating into a few major charities?
Well, it is an inefficient use of funds in the sense that they all need their separate administrative structure. And also, it's sometimes a problem for the governments of low-income countries, because they may be facing a lot of applications to do projects in those countries, and they're spending time doing that when really a smaller number of larger projects would do just as well. On the other hand, the fact that people can start their own organization has led, I think, to some very successful, lean and efficient organizations. And I've already mentioned the Against Malaria Foundation, which is just one of those organizations. It was started by somebody who saw a need for something that wasn't being done at the time elsewhere, and ran it out of his home office, and just had a couple of other people working, and then made contacts with people in the countries where malaria is prevalent and is killing people. And so built that up. So, somebody could have said, well, why did he do that? Oxfam was already in existence. Why didn't he just go and work for Oxfam? But as anybody in the business field would know, sometimes there's a need for a new startup that does something that the older firms haven't seen, and they can be faster and respond more quickly and have new ideas. So I'm not in favour of in any way sort of forcibly restricting the entry of new organisations. But I do wish people would really look around and make sure that they have got something special to offer in starting a new organisation that isn't being done, and that they can do it better than the existing organisations. Because otherwise it does become, in a sense, a sort of personal, an extension of your own ego to say, yes, I've got my own charity. And I'm saying this. I know I founded the Life You Can Save. I'm not actually hands on. I'm chair of the board, but there's a couple of other people who do the running of it, and it's a very small organisation as well. It has I don't know, the equivalent of 3 or 4 full-time employees. But I do think it is doing something that wasn't being done elsewhere, and that's why I think it's worth doing.
Peter, having engaged with some of your material on and off for at least the past 12 months, one of the I guess the phrases that perhaps many of our listeners don't understand is this idea of effective altruism. I think you described it in your TED talk as effectively, once you understand the value of a life and all those being equal, the maths and the economics are really the simple part of effectively where you should allocate your money if you are giving. Can you explain the concept of effective altruism, maybe even with an example if you have one handy?
Well, certainly. So I think most people understand the idea of altruism. That is, that we shouldn't be thinking just about ourselves, but we should also be thinking about others. That is, we don't expect people to be saints and only think about others. But one of your life goals should be, I think, trying to leave the world a better place, trying to do the most good that you can, or something of that sort, for at least part of your objectives. And then the effective part of that is saying, whatever resources you are going to put in that altruistic direction, whether that's time or skills or money, try to get the best value out of that you can. And that might sound very obvious, but it's surprising though how few people do that. When you think about making large-sized consumer purchases, then almost everybody does it. Almost everybody who wants to buy a new phone or a new laptop or a new car will do some research into saying, well, where can I get a good deal? What will give me what I need at the lowest cost? But when it comes to giving to charity, relatively few people do that. They're much more pulled by their emotions. They see a brochure with a picture of a smiling child, or maybe nowadays they see something online, and they think, "Oh, that looks good. I'll donate to that." But I think it's just as important, or even more important, to do research into making sure that what you're doing in that area of altruism is effective. And you mentioned the mathematics. Well, you don't have to do the mathematics, because if you really are a research nerd and want to check it all out for yourself, you can certainly do it. But there are, through these organizations I mentioned, there are teams of researchers who are doing this full time, who are completely independent of the organizations that they're recommending, who don't get any kind of commission or cut from those organizations. And so that's what makes it a lot easier for the ordinary person to be an effective altruist than it would have been, say, 20 years ago when that kind of research just wasn't available.
And people listening to this could take the table in your book and identify where they sit in terms of their salary, and the number that you gave us before in terms of how much it costs to save a life. And I think the only thing missing between that is that ability to effectively use that money. As investors, we always think about the most effective use of our capital, but also our time and everything else. It's a conscious decision. So this is just that bridge there that people should be making. And thanks to organizations like yours, and we'll provide links in the show notes, they can.
Yeah, and I remember now that you asked me to give you an example. So in fact, one of the earliest people in the effective altruism movement to actually get it started, before there was even that term for it, is another Australian, a man called Toby Ord, who is from Melbourne but went to Oxford, did a graduate degree there, and is now an associate professor. I don't remember his exact title, at Oxford, and he wanted to make that kind of calculation for himself. How much good could I actually do? And so he assumed that he was going to have an academic career, which means you have a fairly predictable salary as you rise through the academic ranks. So he assumed, he looked at how much he was likely to earn by the time he retired. This was while he was still a PhD student, and took that sum of money and then looked around to say, how can I use that most effectively? And what he came up with was an organization that was preventing blindness caused by trachoma. Trachoma is the largest cause of preventable blindness in the world. It's mostly something that occurs in hot, dry, dusty countries where hygiene is poor. It does exist in Australia, in the north, but much less. And of course, people can get treatment for it. But in a lot of North African countries and some other countries, it's prevalent, and it slowly causes blindness over many years. So Toby looked at some articles as to what it costs to prevent that, and he worked out that if he continued to live modestly while earning an academic salary and going up through the ranks, that he would be able to prevent 80,000 people going blind. Think of that. You imagine
Wow.
the MCG almost packed with people. It doesn't happen nowadays, I know, but hopefully it'll happen again. And you could look around that MCG filled with crowds for a grand final or something, and you could say, wow, that's how many people I prevented going blind. And this is not because I'm like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, because I've been a vastly successful, wealthy person. This is because I simply lived modestly while earning a decent academic salaries throughout my life.
Incredible. And I think that's kind of the visceral nature and the takeaway that people need to remember every time they see that little bit of money come out of their account. Kate, I know you have a few more questions that you want to get off.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, Peter, is the concept of how we can help people the most in our careers, and how can we use our careers in a more effective way to solve these problems. And not all of us are going to be working in nonprofits and helping to end world poverty and some of these things. And I think a lot of our listeners do work in that banking and finance industry. So do you have some ideas on how we can use our careers more effectively to help with these global issues?
Yes, I can. And I think it's to some extent, I think, reassuring for people who are in investment and finance, who sometimes get a bit of flack from people who say, oh, you're the bad guys. You're the guys who are running things you're doing it for your own, to get rich yourself, and you're causing problems elsewhere in the world. So it's not an ethical career choice. But one of the things that effective altruists have suggested in talking about career choice is that earning to give is a reasonable career choice if you can stick with it. So I just mentioned that on an academic salary, Toby Ord calculated he could prevent 80,000 people from going blind. Obviously, if he had been a successful investor and successful in the financial sector, he could have earned a lot more money and could have prevented blindness in a lot more people, or could have helped other people in other ways. So effective altruists suggest that if you have a talent for making money, and you also have the character to stick to the resolution to give away a significant share of your income, and not kind of to get seduced by the expensive toys that people in the finance industry often end up buying, that could be a very ethical career choice. And I had a student at Princeton who was influenced by this way of thinking. And although he could have had a career as an academic, he was very good at philosophy too. He went to Wall Street and ended up as writing algorithms for a commodity trading company. And now I guess it's something like, this is 8 or 9 years ago. He's been giving away half of his income ever since. So he's done an immense amount of good with that kind of money, because he was earning a 6-figure salary, I think, from the year he started. So that's one possible career choice. Obviously, it's not the only one. You can do good by working for a non-profit organization and making it more effective. You can do good by going into research and finding ways to have clean energy, or let's say at the moment, helping to develop a vaccine against COVID, the virus that causes COVID-19. So there's lots of other options. But if you're interested in that there's a website for that too, and it's called 80,000 Hours, which somebody calculated as the number of hours most people spend in their careers. So I thought there is, appealing mostly to younger people who haven't settled into their career. Spend some time thinking about what is a good career for you, but also an ethical career, a good career for the world, which may make your life more fulfilling and satisfying anyway. And that website offers a lot of options and discussions about effective careers.
Peter, there's one more question that we didn't have on our list to get to, but it's just a quick one. I know you've done a lot of work in terms of animals and ethics, and now with giving. One of the things that I often struggle with is, I guess, not doing enough. So I feel like, I'm a vegetarian now, because of the climate change perspective, but also from an animal rights perspective. But then also, with my business and setting it up the way I have, I often feel so compelled to give back that it's almost this pressure that I can't take off. Do you often find, or do people come to you and say, I'm so stressed out about how much I should be giving? Should I be doing more? I need to do more. How do we know where that line is? I find that such a difficult question to answer.
It's a difficult question to answer in the abstract, certainly. But, I tell people not to stress about finding exactly the right line, but rather to start somewhere. And, sometimes for people who are pretty comfortably off already, as perhaps successful investors anyway are, I say, look, start by giving away 10% of your income. It's a nice round figure. It's the traditional tithe, and it is quite substantial. So start with that, get comfortable with that. If you're really doing well, you may get comfortable enough with that you think that's not enough. I could do more, and I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I'm finding it worthwhile, and it makes what I'm doing with my time and the money more worthwhile. So I'll go up to 20%. But I don't stress about saying, am I at exactly the right level? I rather say, am I doing something significant? Am I comfortable with this? Could I do a little bit more next year? And gradually you'll find, I think, the point at which you feel you're doing something really worthwhile, and perhaps there'll be a point at which to do more you think would be too much of a sacrifice for yourself and your family and those who depend on you, and it would be unreasonable to expect your partner to go along with that. Again, this is obviously something you discuss with your partner if you have one. So I think make sure you're doing something substantial. You're sort of, if you like, well ahead of the curve as to where people are on this, because that's not really very, at the right point at all, I think. And then take it from there.
Well, that's great advice. It helps me put my mind at ease a bit, Peter, I must admit. And I imagine this conversation that we're having now with Kate and everyone that listens is going to be motivational for them. But in any case, what we'll do is we'll share all of the links, including to getting access to the free book, your free book and all of your works. But Peter, on behalf of Kate and I, thanks for taking the time out this evening to join us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.